Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the launch of our new Footprint Intelligence White Paper, Deliver Commercial Advantage Through Sustainable Water Management, in association with Waterscan. My name's Nick Hughes, Footprint Associate Editor and author of the White Paper. I'll shortly begin by spending 10 to 15 minutes running through the White Paper's key findings, after which we'll drill down into some of the major themes with a panel of experts. At this point, you'll have the opportunity to ask any burning questions you may have via the Q&A function. And we'll wrap things up just before midday. The white paper itself will be dropping into subscribers' inboxes as a free download shortly after the launch and will also be available via the Footprint website. Before I share the key findings, I think it's important to note from the outset that water is a multifaceted environmental issue, encompassing the entire value chain from commodity crop production in water-stressed regions of the world, right through to the use of water in the daily operations of restaurants, pubs, hotels, and other out-of-home venues. Today's white paper focuses predominantly on water management within those downstream operations. But needless to say, you'll find plenty of content and resources on issues concerning upstream water security and sustainability on the Footprint website. So historically, I think it's fair to say water has often been seen as a cheap, plentiful resource, particularly in temperate regions like the United Kingdom, where it's a favourite national pastime to complain about the rainy weather. But it feels like these past few years have really been a wake-up call for governments, for businesses, and for we as citizens, that we can no longer take reliable access to water for granted. We need only cast our minds back 3 years to the dry, hot summer of 2022, during which water supplies ran extremely low and businesses and households were told to reduce their use of water via hosepipe bans and other restrictions. And more generally, we've started to see water scarcity have a knock-on effect on businesses' growth ambitions, as certain councils refuse new connections in water-stressed areas. There's now an appreciation at the highest levels of government that without strategic action, we're going to be faced with a severe shortfall in years to come between the availability of sustainable water supplies on the one hand and expected demand on the other. And so ensuring a sustainable supply of water must be seen as a key national infrastructure priority. With that in mind, the Environment Act 2021 set a target for a 20% reduction in the use of water per head of the population by 2037 to 38 from a 2019-20 baseline. Water companies have a key role to play in delivering that target by, for example, accelerating the rollout of smart meters, reducing leakage, and upgrading infrastructure. But of course, all of this comes at a cost. If you've been unfortunate enough, like me, to open a water bill this past month, you'll have noticed the price has rocketed. Now, that's the case for businesses as well as households. And if you're operating in a sector like hospitality, for which water is an indispensable resource, then the implications of these cost increases are significant. Food preparation, dishwashing, cleaning, showering, just a few of the everyday tasks that can only be accomplished within hospitality with reliable access to water. Without it, you simply don't have a functioning business. And this is a key point, perhaps the most crucial point from the white paper. The era of cheap water is over. More so than ever, saving water has become a financial as well as a sustainability imperative. The good news is that with effective water management, businesses can unlock cost savings, improve their operational resilience, attract investment, and deliver on their sustainability ambitions. So how should you go about doing that? Well, a good starting point, in fact, an essential starting point, is to gain visibility over your water usage. That comes from having access to high quality, real-time data. The most forward-thinking businesses are using extensive metering across sites to continually monitor changes in water use consumption within their operations. That in turn enables them to identify water use hotspots and target the most impactful areas for investment. Pub Group Marston's, for example, is a business that is already reaping the benefits from deploying automatic meter reading loggers in high water consuming sites. During the past financial year, it saved over 100 million pints of water by using that data to identify and fix inefficiencies and leaks. One way in which to gain greater control over that data is to supply your own water. For those that don't know, self-supply allows businesses to become their own water retailer effectively and form direct relationships with wholesalers. By ensuring accurate readings and bills, self-supply gives businesses cost certainty, which then in turn enables more accurate budgeting. Businesses that have already gone down the self-supply route, like Whitbread, say it's been incredibly beneficial in improving the level of analysis of their water use data. So knowing how much water you are using is an important starting point on a journey to greater water efficiency. But visibility of data alone is largely worthless unless you have a strategy in place to improve that efficiency. So what does a good strategy look like? Well, unfortunately, there is no off-the-shelf template. A strategy really does need to be rooted in the specific business context with clear, relevant objectives and milestones. And it should set out what it is you plan to do, why you plan to do it, and what are the key actions you plan to take in order to deliver it. Some of the specific areas a strategy might cover include your approach to capturing and managing data, governance, including senior leadership ownership of the strategy and its targets, potential barriers to delivery and dependencies, including within the supply chain, an insight into the types of activities that will allow you to reach your goals, such as investment in technology and behavior change initiatives. And we'll come on to some of those shortly. Some businesses choose to set time-bound targets against which they can monitor progress at regular intervals. These can help galvanize action within the business, but they do need to be achievable and they need to be consistently tracked over time. So what are some of the activities you can engage in to improve your management of water? Water efficiency measures broadly fall into three buckets: good housekeeping, investment in equipment, and behavior change. Good housekeeping involves regular maintenance of equipment and prompt fixing of leaks, fixing leaky toilets, for example, as well as more proactive measures like preventing urinals from automatically flushing overnight. Many businesses are also investing in more water efficient equipment across their estates. That includes switching to things like low flow shower heads, putting flow regulators on taps and toilets. Often operators will trial these measures across a small number of sites to build the business case. Once you can demonstrate both cost savings and no negative impact on the customer experience, it then becomes a no-brainer to commit to a full rollout. Kitchens are another area ripe for investment in efficiency measures. Nando's, for example, has made kitchen taps push to go so they can't ever be left running. Kitchens are also an important setting for encouraging a change in behaviours to use water more responsibly. That might mean, for example, asking chefs not to leave taps running constantly when preparing vegetables or cleaning down workstations, ensuring dishwasher loads are full and set to the most efficient rinse setting. And the same goes for front of house processes, such as cleaning, which should be regularly reviewed to avoid unnecessary water wastage. And then, of course, there's the opportunity to educate customers on how they can contribute to more sustainable water usage by inviting them to skip a daily room cleaning service, for instance, or reuse towels. And finally, it's important to look at opportunities to capture non-potable water like rainwater and wastewater and put it to work within the business for flushing toilets or irrigating garden areas, for example. This ability becomes particularly important during periods of water use restrictions, and we detail some examples of operators investing in water reuse initiatives within the white paper. So to conclude, we've entered an era where the drive to use more water more efficiently has significant political and commercial momentum, where the economic case for using less water has aligned with the environmental case. Now more than ever, it is vital that hospitality and food service operators think strategically about their use of this critical resource. So we're now going to explore some of the white paper's main findings with the help of our panel. Should you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our very best to get them answered in the time we have. To begin, I'm going to invite each panelist in turn to introduce themselves and their organisation and briefly summarise why they see sustainable water management as a critical issue for the hospitality sector. So Rebecca, perhaps I can start with you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm Head of Sustainability at Waterscan. We are a sustainable water management consultancy. We work with big businesses in the UK across numerous sectors. So examples of that are Green King, Whitbread, CCEP. I think sustainable water management is a critical issue for four main reasons. One is the rising cost. So on average, a 25% increase in bills, up to 50% in some regions this year. Operational and climate risk, so mitigating reduced availability. Reputational customer expectations. So increasingly, we're seeing consumers want more environmentally friendly choices. And investor pressure and regulation. So in 2024, CDP saw a 122% increase in investors requesting water disclosures from companies. So really, really brief, 4 pillars. Why should act on water?
Super, thanks Rebecca. And Patrick.
Hi, thanks Nick. I'm Patrick. I'm the Head of Operations at Hawksmoor. We are a B Corp accredited company. We have 3 stars by the SRA, the Sustainable Restaurant Association. Water is critical for us as a business. It's quite simply, in operational terms, we can't operate without a water supply. We legally will have to close. So that's a pretty big issue for us. But also from a sort of purpose and people perspective, we do a values survey every year, and 98% of our employees told us that they want to work somewhere that has strong purpose and sustainability goals. So it aligns both from the business and the people that work here.
Thanks, Patrick. Sam?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I'm Sam. So I'm the sustainability manager for Asahi here in the UK. So if you don't know Asahi, they are a kind of global beverage company, predominantly working in beer. So you may know the kind of key Japanese beer, Asahi Super Dry, that we're famous for. But we also have other brands such as Peroni, Grolsch, and Fuller's London Pride here in the UK. And it's, no surprise that water is very important to us. It's, 90 to 95% of what's in each pint of beer is water. So it is our biggest ingredient by a country mile. So without water, we don't have a product to sell. And it's, important to us, not just for the making of the product, but right through our value chain as well. So our biggest risk, climate-related risk for our business, is drought and flooding in relation to the sourcing of our ingredients that also go into the making of beer. So in many ways, water is the biggest thread and the most important commodity that sustains our business. And beer is pretty much the number one product that you'd find in most pubs, and pubs are very much the cornerstone of UK hospitality. So that kind of risk kind of gets passed down really through the whole drinks and hospitality sector.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And finally, Louis.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Louis Gorey-Morris. I'm the Partnerships Director at Water Unite. If you haven't heard of us, we're a global non-profit with a mission to provide clean water for people and planet. And since 2017, we've been partnering with large corporates to raise funds to fund programs across the global south. Our primary sort of fundraising model is what we call a micro levy, which is a small donation on the sales of products. We've been working in the UK with people like Co-op on their bottled water sales, as well as some of their branded soft drinks. And in the food service industry, we've been working with Elior since 2019, raising a 1 pence per litre donation on their water sales, which has raised about £100,000 to date. In terms of why it's critical, I think since we started partnering with organisations, the view on water has shifted. Initially, it was about a societal issue. Corporations understood the impact globally on the lack of access to water, but it's certainly grown now to be identified as a strategic issue. And that actually, if you don't address water security globally and at home, that's ultimately going to have a long-term impact on your supply chains, on your business, and on your consumers. And as that's developed, we've seen consumer awareness also change. Water pollution is always identified as one of the top 5 consumer concerns in the UK. So I think it's important for organisations to act, one, for their own interests, but also there are commercial upsides to tackling the key challenges around water.
Great. Thanks very much, Louis. That takes us nicely into the discussion. I think let's start perhaps with the strategic element, as Louis touched upon there. Certainly feels as though for businesses, understanding of water as a risk issue has increased significantly in recent years. But in terms of the need to have a strategy for tackling sustainable water management, Rebecca, why is having a water strategy so important, would you say?
Yeah, I think you touched on it then. It's a risk mitigation technique, isn't it? So I think to understand your risk, you have to understand your impact on water and your dependency on water. And that's kind of data led. So where are you using water? How much? When are you using it? There's a seasonality element to water use. And once you know that can then translate into risks and also where your opportunities are on water. And that's done in a really defined data-led way. And I think strategies don't have to be reduction targets. They can encompass overarching goals, how you govern, how governance works on water, kind of how you're reporting it, your priorities and roadmaps to get there, and kind of short-term goals as well as longer-term targets. And really encompassing that with metrics and KPIs.
And what would be some of the key? I mean, we touched on some of them in the white paper overview, but what would be some of the sort of key metrics and KPIs you'd like to see in a strategy?
So I guess a really basic one is around leakage. So kind of what the process is around how you're identifying leaks, how quickly you can identify them, how quickly you can fix them, what the barriers that kind of are stopping you achieve kind of what good looks like, what percentage of your estate is leaking at any one time. Older estates are going to have a higher level of leakage as kind of manufacturing and smaller estates. So really quantifying kind of where you are and where it's feasible that you could be around leakage, I think is a really good one. I think leakage is a maintenance of a baseline. It's not the reduction. Until you've really controlled leakage, you're not going to be able to do the water efficiency work and really reap the benefits of that without the really strict controls on leakage. So I think that's just like a really key one.
Patrick, you clearly you said that without access to water, you don't have a business at Hawksmoor. So how do you approach this from a strategic perspective? Do you have a dedicated water strategy for the business, and what does that look like, if so?
Yeah, we really pushed on in this area in the last few years specifically, but sort of touching on what Rebecca said, we started with monitoring and metering, so our data is now coming through much more frequently. We track it monthly, and we've also set ourselves, yearly reduction targets. But, just to sort of touch further on the leakage point, we get notifications if there's a spike in usage. So it can tell us based on a 4-week average, you've had a spike of usage there. So it prompts, myself, thankfully for 11 restaurants, but more importantly, the managers in those restaurants, to go and do a check of the building and try and identify if there's a leak. We've got an in-house maintenance team who are available almost 24/7 actually to respond reactively and prioritize those sorts of issues. So that's sort of a fairly low-hanging situation. But sort of wider from that, we have implemented some sort of behaviour change initiatives. So we have provided briefing packs for the managers in the restaurants to educate and deliver to their teams. We have produced posters which go up in back of house areas and staff rooms, and we also do annual sort of competitions to try and incentivize short-term reductions. So, for instance, at the moment we're running a competition for each site. Whoever shows the biggest water reduction in their site will get pizza at the end of the month for their whole team. So it kind of incentivizes that, but also gives them something that they can all work on collectively. And the nice thing is we've used whiteboards in some of the back of house spaces to highlight this. It was Earth Day recently, so it gave them an opportunity to write down things that they do at home. So it's not just in the restaurants, but they take it home as well and do that there. I'll touch on operational changes and investments maybe a little bit later on, but another thing you mentioned was the governance side of it, and purpose is really a massive part of the business, and it is included in our business plan, and its targets are included as part of the bonus structure for some of the senior managers and directors of the company. So it's really embedded right the way through.
Okay, interesting. Thank you, Patrick. Sam, obviously Asahi positioned slightly differently from Hawksmoor. You're a little bit further upstream the supply chain, and obviously running huge brewery operations. What does do you have a sustainable water management strategy for the business, and what does that look like?
Yeah, good question. I appreciate we're in quite a different situation to Patrick, who has huge amounts of kind of employees and sites to manage, and it's probably finding a lot of small gains all over the place. Whereas we're in the slightly different situation of having fewer big impact sites, right? As you kind of alluded to, Nick. So we do have a water strategy that to date has really focused on our own operations and our water use to really drive that down. So we have a target of using 2.75 litres of water on average for every litre of beer that we brew. And it's really important for us to kind of have that target in sight and then to roadmap it out how we get there. Because early on, there may be some low-hanging fruit that you can get from things like leakages and improvements in the existing system. But the reality is actually it's going to need quite big scale investment to look at some form of water recovery or whole new pieces of machinery that are more efficient with their water use, or introducing new processes to make our water use more circular within the brewery. And that's complicated not just from an investment standpoint, but to work with the teams in the brewery to kind of figure it out. So it's quite a complex equation with water when there's so many different lines and water streams within the brewery. So that's where our strategy has been to date, and that kind of main complexity around investment and how you undertake these kind of large scale changes through the brewery over the next 5 years to hit that 2030 target.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Louis, turning back to you, obviously we've got Patrick and Sam from two businesses that are taking the issue of water very seriously. You'll have conversations, I'm sure, with lots of different corporate partners and prospective partners about water. Where do you see the food industry, the hospitality sector as a whole in terms of awareness of these issues and appetite to act on it? Because I'm very conscious that, in these conversations, we will be speaking with the most progressive businesses. Where are most businesses on this journey, do you feel?
It's a good question. I think it's definitely moved positively quite considerably in the last 5 years. So I think many of the conversations we would have with corporates would normally focus on the sustainability teams, and there might be a level of education about why water was important. Why water, not climate? Why water, not plastics? But I think now water isn't seen in a silo anymore. It's seen as one of those key issues. So I think there's been a lot of development, and there's organizations like Hawksmoor and Asahi that have kind of pulled others along with them, by being industry leaders. But I think it's the water is kind of almost where the carbon market was in terms of starting to record on carbon, starting to offset carbon maybe five years ago. So where we kind of act as a non-profit would be the equivalent of sort of scope 3 in the carbon market. So effectively almost like an offset or further downstream in supply chains globally. And that used to very much be done in silo because organizations recognized that was a nice to have. It was a positive thing they could communicate to their consumers. That's all now being pieced together with the overall strategy of the business. And that starts with being able to measure their water footprint, and then being able to piece together, okay, what can I do at home to reduce my water use? What can I do with my suppliers? And then what can I do globally in key water regions? And that's far more sophisticated conversation than was happening 5 years ago. So I think it's definitely a positive outlook. But there's still a bit of a journey to go on, to really start to mitigate and become water neutral businesses.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Well, let's touch on the data point as well, I think, because what comes out of the white paper is that I suppose a strategy without data is not especially helpful, but equally data without a strategy is not especially useful. You need both of those things. And visibility of data is a key starting point. So Rebecca, again, this is detailed in the white paper, but be helpful, I think, to understand from your perspective how businesses can get the best possible visibility over their water use data. What are the key things that they need to be doing?
Mm-hmm. So I guess the market's developing a solution to help with that, where I think AMR's been cost prohibitive to a lot of kind of smaller sites, where the return isn't as guaranteed, but we'll have quite a high penetration of smart meters in the UK, in England, over the next AMP cycle, so up to 2030. So that should be granular data of hourly flow. And essentially that's kind of part of the price rise, is that investment in the industry. So optimizing on that because everyone's paying for it kind of now. So that benefit of that is identifying continuous flow. So we've seen with a lot of the customers we work with, there's some sites where they would be within what we'd call a benchmark that fits with other sites. But actually, when we get that granular data, we see there's some level of continuous flow, which indicates a leak. So those would never have flagged from visual reads that those sites could have potentially had a problem. And we can see that down to a really low level of leakage. And wholesalers, in doing these rollouts, kind of want the return in the water reductions, and they're incentivized to make those demand reductions, and leakage is one of the ways that they're going to do it. So they're pushing customers to fix those leakage from the continuous flow. And I think that's a really basic use of the data. So in addition to that, actually breaking down that data into 24-hour periods, weekly periods, seasonal periods, and overlaying that data with kind of business metrics. So like swipe data, footfall data, sleeper data, cover data, to see which sites are performing better than others, and then really investigating why that is. And that really can only be done with kind of AMI data. And then touching slightly on behaviour change, because I'm not totally sure if the data will show this, but can you see from the granular data where sites are doing things differently to others in different time periods, and how similar are sites across an estate that you can do that kind of analysis to see whether certain chefs use water differently on different days of the week to others, and if there's something you can do on that. I know the classic hotel example of cleaners flushing the toilets lots of times as a cleaning process, and actually this specific hotel chain could reduce their water by changing a cleaning process that they identified through that granular AMR data. So lots of usage.
Yeah, absolutely. Patrick, based on what Rebecca's described there, how sort of far advanced would you say Hawksmoor's understanding of your water usage is? And is that consistent across the entire estate as well? Or do you have a sort of better understanding in some sites than you do in others?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, we've got the metering at the supply level. But recently, we've done a project to audit the usage specifically from the pre-rinse taps, which are used in the KP section. If you're familiar with restaurants, there's a sort of hose that sits in the sink, which is quite fun to use and quite powerful. And it's also very highly consuming. And not only from solely from a sort of consumption basis, but also it uses hot water as well. So obviously there's a cost behind that, and the heating of the hot water. And so we've identified that as one of the highest consuming sort of areas of the business. And so a couple of things really. Previously, we've already reduced valve flows on all of the sort of customer-facing outlets and also back of house, but specifically on this pre-rinse as well, we've also blended the temperatures of the water so that it's using less hot, but also coming out less powerfully. Because really, that is the role of a dishwasher, right? A dishwasher is there to clean things, and that's just the function is to rinse it. So it doesn't need to be quite as powerful and quite as hot as they are set at. So yeah, that's one area. And then I think another area that we've been looking at is again, you mentioned sort of washing vegetables and auditing behavior change, and that was kind of the education piece that we did around the briefing. So it's letting people know the change in the, I guess, environment around water and the perception of water, and that it isn't just a abundant commodity anymore, and actually leaving taps running when they don't need to be, or leaving them unattended is just not the way we do things. So we educate and we train our managers to call those things out. And then lastly, we have, as I mentioned at the start, we have such a engaged workforce when it comes to purpose and sustainability. As I said, 98% of the people that work here, and I'm sure this is reflective across the whole industry, really care about it. And so we started something called a green team, and we have a number of people from each restaurant across each department who come together monthly and talk about some of these much smaller issues and try and come up with solutions for them. But they are also in the restaurants every single day, noticing things and spotting things and not calling people out, but just reminding people, right? Let's switch that light off when you leave the room. Don't leave that tap running if it doesn't need to be. Make sure you use the correct bin for sort of, the recycling. So all of those things, then we have people on the ground in the restaurants who really, really sort of care about this sort of work. So that really has helped to move the dial.
Thanks, Patrick. Sam, similarly in a brewery setting, huge amounts of water being used. What's the kind of granularity, if I can say it, of data that you can access in terms of understanding where water is being used and where perhaps it's red flags might be raised or hotspots that shouldn't be hotspots are being identified? What kind of level of sub-metering, for example, would you be doing within an average large brewery?
Yeah, it blows my mind constantly how many different processes there are that go on within the brewery that you just never even think of off the top of your head. So we undertook a study with a consultancy last year to map out our brewery, and I wasn't envious of them because our biggest brewery in the UK is the Fuller's Brewery in Chiswick that you might see when you drive west out of London. and it is a Victorian brewery that is a little bit kind of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory kind of esque. And you go through there, and it is a maze of pipes going in all sorts of directions through walls, etc. So to map out all the pipes and where they're going was a mission in itself. And the conclusion of all of that is we need more meters. We already had quite a lot of metering on all of the main processes, but to understand what's really going on, we needed to go to a whole other level to work out exactly where those losses are happening, and how we can recover them. So we're needing to go deep still. And it's interesting where stuff starts to come up. So like one big place for us was all around cleaning in place, CIP, which is essentially the washing down of all of your tanks and equipment in between each brew, which is important for kind of quality and hygiene, but then can use a surprisingly huge amount of water. So the equipment you use to clean, the chemicals that you use and don't use. So if you use some chemicals, it can mean that you're more efficient with water. However, it can restrict you to not being as circular with that water and recovering it and use it for other purposes. So it was a key area. And the other big one that we look at is also around heat, because obviously we're using the water to make the beer, but you also use water within the heating process and water as a tool for cooling. So the more actually circular we can be with our heating and cooling processes, the less we need new input water to perform those tools as well. And that actually plays a really key role, because as you pointed out in the report, water is getting more expensive, but it's also quite cheap as a commodity. So if you want to unlock investment for a project, if you can combine it with heat projects that are saving heat, and gas being a far more expensive kind of commodity to buy, you can then potentially put together a better big business case for investment that are going to drive down both your water use and your heating use.
Great, thanks, Sam. And just to pick up on something, Sam, you said earlier around a desire to explore more circular uses of water as well, and the opportunity to reuse water already within your operations. Can you just explain a little bit about what that work might look like in practice and where you're looking for opportunities?
Yeah, I think so one of the key areas is that cleaning in place water. So depending on the quality of the water that comes off with the cleaning process, so you might not be able to recover the initial wash that has a high amount of either organic waste or chemical waste in there. That kind of needs to be captured securely to be then treated properly. But some of the less dirty water, that kind of second wash water, that could be recovered and then put into your heating and cooling system. So it can be used within a heat exchanger, for example, to help part of the kind of cooling process later on. So it's finding those opportunity to get a second hit or a third hit out of the water that you're using, instead of it just being a linear process.
Great, thank you. Louis, you touched on it earlier about a partnership you have with Elior. I think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about that, because that's a business, obviously a contract catering business, in an interesting position in the supply chain insofar as working on client sites, but not necessarily with direct control over what happens in those client sites, but also upstream, often sourcing via wholesalers and distributors, and can be quite a challenge to gain visibility over the end-to-end value chain. So what does the work entail with Elior, and what kind of progress have you made so far through that partnership?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting case study of controlling what you can control when it comes to tackling water, because I think water can sometimes be seen as such a massive issue that it's hard to know what the first step to make is. And I think in the case of Elior, they identified in particular that they were selling bottled water in this case, and there was a desire for bottled water within their clients and their end consumers, but they wanted to do it in an ethical manner because of the issues associated with bottled water. And one thing that they could control was actually putting a micro levy, a small donation, on the sales of that water. So in this case, it's 1 pence per litre. And that actually funds programs across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that are having impacts tackling water issues. So it funds programs across 5 key pillars. The first one is access to clean drinking water. The second one is access to sanitation and toilets. The third one is wastewater pollution. So actually we fund a program not too dissimilar to some of the stuff that Sam was just covering, which is actually working in Indonesia on wastewater circularity. It also funds programs on a fourth pillar, which is plastics and solid waste circularity. And the fifth one is water security. So through that program, they've been able to meet that demand for water, but also have a positive impact in areas that are really impacted by water security and water shortage across the globe. And it's another nice example of also how you can engage consumers to follow you on that sustainability journey. So, often issues around sustainability and around water are just seen as a cost to a business. Maybe you can make savings, of course. There's upsides there, but actually, in this case, we were able to communicate this program directly to consumers. So, consumers at Elior sites, every time they picked up a bottle of water, they knew that they were doing good because it was being promoted by point of sale material or digital posters. So it was connecting that specific purchase with creating clean water on the other side of the globe. So it may not have been a in-house water utility program, but in 2019 it was a great first step for Elior to be start to make positive impacts around water. And actually, as I mentioned in one of your earlier questions, the sophistication around water has increased, and Elior of a business are now much more looking at, okay, well, what can they do at their sites, what can they do at their suppliers, and then the work we do plays a sort of vital role in what are the key watersheds that they're concerned about globally, and how can they support communities and the environment in those watersheds.
Thanks, Louis. We've got about 5 or 10 minutes remaining, so last call for any questions. If you have anything you'd like to ask our panelists, please do put it in the Q&A, and we should just about have time to come to those before we finish. I want to touch on behaviour change. Patrick's already mentioned introducing a competitive element, if you like, to behaviour change, encouraging individual sites to sort of compete on water saving. Rebecca, from your perspective, what works well when it comes to behaviour change, and perhaps what doesn't work so well as well?
I think to caveat this, I'm not a behaviour change expert, and it is such a broad field that there's definitely some theoretical approaches that I think are quite untapped by the industry, and that's something that we're looking at is what hasn't been done before. I think as a good example of one, more on the consumer side than the staff side, is when you actually look at water efficient technology, how do you get buy-in from consumers on that, and what the feedback is on that? So there are a lot of industries where consumers are quite influential on the water usage at the site. But it's obviously really important to a business to get positive feedback from those consumers. So potentially we've got some customers looking at, I guess it would potentially come under stealth, but reducing flow rates at a rate where it's not necessarily noticeable that water's being reduced. So instead of going for like a shower where there's a 20% reduction in the flow rate, which is obviously going to be really obvious, actually, how can you do that at a slower pace that it's less obvious that there's less water coming out? Pressure of showers is a really good one. Like, actually, there's literature and research around how the pressure of showers changes the amount of time someone spends in the shower. The same would be for taps. The pressure of taps, like how low can you go on that, and how acceptable is that to the consumer? So there's some really interesting work going around in the market on that. Data, showing consumers data and how they use water around having that visibility. That's quite a powerful one. Showing someone something that's measurable does actually work, and that then feeds into kind of employee remuneration, league tables, competition. They all work really well. And then there's kind of the ones that have been tried and tested quite a few times, is increasing water literacy. I personally think that's a less strong driver than the kind of the others that I've touched on. But I think us as a business, we're quite interested to see how far we could push behaviour change in some of the less well-known concepts.
Patrick, the competitive element that you touched on earlier, has that motivated employees to compete, if you like, in trying to reduce water use?
Yeah, definitely. Any sort of competitive element seems to work, and I think it's just, I guess, touching on what Rebecca said, it behaviour change is difficult. Our primary focus is to serve great food, deliver great customer experience, and then we're asking our teams and our managers to also add an extra element to what they do, and not only understand something that might be quite new to them, but then also motivate their team to deliver that as well. So yes, the competitive element does help, but I think that you see shorter term, improvements and reductions, and it's only when you sort of reignite that, okay, let's do some more briefings around that, or let's put a focus on this, or let's link it to Earth Day like we've done recently, that you then see that momentum again. So it's definitely harder to show sort of longer term sustained results when it comes to that side of things, which is why some of the operational changes, although they take an investment, they are then part of the foundation of the building, and they are part of the process and infrastructure of the way we operate, which is probably has obviously longer term impact.
Sam, just as we begin to wrap up, what is the, you've talked a lot about what you've already done and are doing in terms of sustainable water use. What's the next frontier in sustainable water management for Asahi? If we were speaking again in 2 to 3 years' time, where would you hope you might have got to? Perhaps that what's in the pipeline, if you like.
I'm so glad you asked, because I really hope we get there. And I think, linking into the behavior change element of it, less behavior change, but more like knowledge and understanding. I think it's easier to make that first approach with water with a simplistic understanding of there's low availability, we need to reduce the amount we're using of it. But the reality is water is so much more complex than that. And I'd say in many ways it's more complex than carbon, because carbon is a kind of a global issue. Carbon for one person is carbon for another, whereas water is so much more localized. So the issues and challenges we have at one brewery, other than the engineering of that brewery itself, would be very different to another one. That's because the environment and landscape that brewery sits will be completely different. So the availability challenges will be very different. The water quality and pollution challenges will be different. It also means that they'll have completely different stakeholders, and with those stakeholders will become very different politics, and their expected role, depending on the scale of the business and its relationship with that environment, will be very different as well. Different expectations on responsibility. So, kind of alluding to, I think the next step is thinking beyond your four walls. You need to think about the area in which your business is operating. And yes, we could do really well in getting our water use down to a nice low number, but we're still going to be using a significant amount of water. And that means we have a role to play within the wider water basin for ensuring that water availability stays secure. And that's a much more complicated equation for all those reasons I said, on how you engage with all those stakeholders and what your role to play is and what needs to happen. And I think that's what we're beginning to get into now. We're doing so in some of our high-risk areas, like in the Netherlands, that's at very high risk of water availability. And I think the biggest challenge around that is you can't have a one-size-fits-all strategy that we bring from the top down in the business, and nor is the knowledge and expertise across the leadership of the business there to be able to deliver that. So you're then needing to rely on great teams in their locality, coming up with quite bespoke and quite varied approaches to engage with their environment and with their wider water basin in the way that fits its local needs. So I hope we get there, but that is a very, very different challenge, which is very much the next step for us.
Great, thanks, Sam. And yeah, a really important point. And just to reiterate that while the focus of this white paper is more on the operational side of things, the supply chain challenges and are huge. Issues of control and your ability to influence upstream come into that. But whether you're a business looking like Sam's to source, hops and barley, or whether you're sourcing citrus fruits or any key commodity, your ability to understand water risk and take actions to mitigate that risk are going to be critical going forward from a sustainability perspective. And of course, that interacts with climate. We shouldn't see water and climate as somehow discrete subjects. They are constantly interacting. Louis, final word to you. And again, sort of looking forward a few years, let's say 3 years, where would you like to see a critical mass of businesses within the food and hospitality sector to be in terms of their understanding of issues relating to water security and management, and the actions that they've taken to start addressing some of those?
That's a big question. So I'll try and give it the big answer it deserves. But I think to have a collection of businesses that have a full understanding of their water footprint in terms of the utilities that they use, and then to expand that to a level to have an understanding of their suppliers' water footprint, and then ultimately, I think Sam's hit the nail on the head, to have an understanding of the wider water ecosystem which they operate in, and the river basins that they are ultimately depleting if they're not able to recycle higher amounts of water. And I think one of the trends that we're already seeing, but I expect it will probably continue, is a lot of the innovations that we've been supporting and we've been seeing in the global south for the last 5-10 years are now becoming increasingly relevant to companies in North America, in Europe. Innovations that are born out of water scarcity, born out of drought, or born out of too much water, around air to water technologies, AOT solutions, AI in smart metering, AI in irrigation, are actually becoming increasingly relevant to the global north as climate changes. I guess I'll leave you with one example to give some color to that. We support a company called Cebex, which is a Tunisian-based company that traditionally worked across North Africa with smallholder farmers to use AI and satellite imagery to give them precision irrigation techniques, depending on whatever crop they were growing. But increasingly, they've seen requirements in the Loire Valley in France that are experiencing the same drought issues that were being experienced in North Africa just 10 years ago. But the technology is still having the same results. In their case, I think they save around 30% water savings, up to 30% water savings, and still seeing crop yields of up to 20%. So it would be great to see organizations like Asahi, like Hawksmoor, who are already there, but being joined by others that have a full sense of their responsibility in the water ecosystem, and actually picking up some of these great innovations and business models that already exist, but potentially haven't been applied to their markets just as yet.
Well, that's a great note to end on, Louis. Thank you. And can I say a huge thank you to our panel for contributing to a fascinating discussion. Thank you as well to Waterscan for their support in making this research possible. Thank you for joining us for today's launch. Whether you're at the start of your own business's journey on sustainable water management, or whether you're already working through a water strategy, I hope you find lots of useful learnings to take back to the business. The white paper itself will be dropping into inboxes shortly, and will also be available on the Footprint website. So I do hope you enjoy reading it. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day.